Today, I'm going to talk about a period in American history and a concept called judicial federalism. Federalism is about the expansion of federal power, so the power of the federal government, over the states and individual lives of the citizens of the United States during the period that when we're actually talking about the Federalists as a political party. So from the signatories of the Constitution, so 1791 through let's say about 1820 or so. That's the period wherein the courts are actively working to assert federal authority just in many of the same ways that the rest of the government, the other branches, are doing the same thing. Now, at the center of this transformation stands one man, John Marshall, the fourth Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, believe it or not, but the first one who really did anything of consequence. By the time that we're all said and done, he'll fundamentally reshape American federalism and enshrine the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. So it's worth pointing out in the beginning that when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, it established a federal system, a government divided between the national authority and the states. But it was a very fragile compromise, to be honest with you. The ink was hardly dry at all when arguments erupted over what that division actually meant. Should states be able to nullify federal laws that they disagree with? Did the federal government have powers beyond those explicitly listed in the Constitution? Could it create a national bank, build roads, regulate commerce in areas traditionally reserved to the states? These weren't just political questions, these were constitutional questions. And the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, would be called upon to do that. But in its early years, the Supreme Court was an obscure institution that had no prestige, no real authority whatsoever. There were no grand Supreme Court chambers. In fact, many Americans would probably say, "What Supreme Court?" Because it met essentially in a basement in New York. It did very, very little. It wasn't seen as prestigious in the least. And that's all going to change under John Marshall. John Marshall was born in a log cabin in rural Virginia in 1755. He served in the Continental Army under George Washington and then studied law. A fervent Federalist, Marshall believed passionately in a strong national government as a unifying force for the new republic. He was appointed Chief Justice in 1801 by President John Adams. In that position, John Marshall would serve for 34 years, the longest tenure of any Chief Justice in American history. But his influence was not just a matter of longevity, it was also about his vision for a United States that was much more unified. And when he was all said and done, the Supreme Court would go from being an obscure group that met in the basement of a building in New York to one of the most important institutions in the American government. It's also worth pointing out Chief Justice John Marshall had a supremely powerful legal mind, and he was an excellent writer. His writing was clear, forceful, and deeply rooted in logic. It was very difficult to argue against some of his decisions. So let's walk through some of the most important judicial federalist opinions to see how John Marshall steadily expanded the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. Well, the most important case by far is Marbury versus Madison, which is pretty straightforward. William Marbury sued to obtain a commission, so it's like a position in the government that was signed by John Adams, but not delivered before Thomas Jefferson's administration took over, and then he refused to comply with the commission. The court ruled ultimately that while Marbury had a right to the commission, the portion of the Judicial Act of 1789 that gave the court original jurisdiction over such matters was unconstitutional. Now, honestly, this doesn't matter at all. Like, the facts of this case are irrelevant. What matters is the concept of judicial review. Judicial review is the idea that the Supreme Court looks at laws that are passed and issues that come up and decides whether or not they conflict with the Constitution. If they do, then they are thrown into the garbage. The concept of judicial review says this Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And if something conflicts with the Constitution, it has to go. The Constitution always takes precedent. And critically, that was the Supreme Court's job. Now, it does not say that in the Constitution. It only says there shall be a Supreme Court. So, for the first time in American history, we have a branch of government grabbing more power than it had under the Constitution. And Marshall's logic was clear on this. He wrote, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is," end quote. In other words, if the Supreme Court didn't have the power of judicial review, then who could? And without the power of judicial review, how would we ever solve conflicts between the Constitution and laws which were inevitably going to be passed? Now, there were other cases. They're not as important as Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is considered to be the foundational decision of the Supreme Court and the most important, but there are other ones that we should talk about. Now, in 1819, after the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States, the state of Maryland tried to tax the Baltimore branch of the National Bank, prompting a local teller, so just a cashier, to refuse to pay the tax. So we have right here a really simple conflict between the state and the federal government. And the question is, who's going to come out on top? And again, from Marshall's perspective, that can only have one answer. The federal government must be the ultimate authority in the land. So the court sided in this case with the cashier. His name is James McCulloch. And the ruling was rather sweeping. Marshall affirmed the federal government's power to create a national bank. And in doing so, he cited the clause in the Constitution that's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that the federal government is allowed to do anything that's necessary and proper to carry out any of its enumerated or listed powers. And to this extent, they said essentially, well, it is necessary in order for a national bank to be accessible to people, you must have branches. Those branches are going to be in the different states. And it is unworkable to allow the states to tax those institutions. Ergo, because it is necessary and proper for the Treasury Department to have a national bank and for that national bank to have branches, as a consequence, they cannot be taxed. So again, we have an extension of federal power at the expense of the states. Okay? The case firmly establishes the principle that federal law is supreme over state law, and the federal government holds implied powers beyond those that are expressly stated in the Constitution. Our next case is Gibbons v. Ogden. It's about the Commerce Clause. So essentially, the state of New York had granted a steamboat monopoly on the Hudson River to a guy by the name of Aaron Ogden. Thomas Gibbons, who held a federal license to the same area, challenged it. The court in this case ruled in favor of Gibbons and his federal license. And essentially, what they argued is, and what I should say, what they decided was, that only Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. So if there's going to be a commercial endeavor that goes between two states, so I'm going to take a bushel of apples from New York and I'm going to go down to Pennsylvania and I'm going to sell those. New York and Pennsylvania can't regulate that transport, but the federal government can because I'm going from one state, New York, to another state, Pennsylvania. Now, the ruling dramatically expanded the scope of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, which later on set the stage for future regulatory authority. So, in addition, we've got some more expansion of powers, and this one's all about contracts. A contract is a written agreement to do two things. This case, Fletcher versus Peck, which is actually from 1810, it's a little bit earlier of a case, arose around what's called the Yazoo land scandal. This takes place in Georgia. Essentially, the state legislature had sold land in a corrupt deal and then tried to void the land sales. So people were getting kickbacks. They found out about it. And so the legislature tried to go back and say, oh, I know you bought that land, but it was sold fraudulently by the previous government. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take that land back. Marshall ruled absolutely not. You can't do that. The state could not invalidate a contract once made, even if that original contract had been based on corruption. Even though it was part of a scheme, it didn't matter because the individuals who got the land, they entered into those contracts willingly and believing them to be legitimate. You can't just go back and do takesies backsies, is what Marshall said. This marked down the first time a Supreme Court struck down a state law as unconstitutional. It established the sanctity of contracts and the limits of state interference in private agreements. Our last case is Dartmouth College versus Woodward. It's all about private charters and public power. So this goes back a long time because Dartmouth College actually got its original charter when we're still in colonial times. So before it was even the United States of America. New Hampshire wanted to take Dartmouth College and change it from a private institution to a state university. And to do so, they had to void the original charter that had been granted to Dartmouth. So it's originating principles, it's documents that gave the college a right to operate. And those have been granted by the then King of England when we're talking about colonial times. And so in this case, the court intervenes and says, very similarly to the last case, that no, this is a private agreement. It's a private institution. We're talking about a private charter that was made between this institution and, at that time, the authority, which was the King of England. And the states can't just simply come in and undo that, even if they say that it's in their best interests to do so. You can kind of see the logic to this because if states were allowed to do that, well, there were a lot of institutions that were created before the United States declared independence from Great Britain. You can't possibly void all of those and attempt to start from scratch in some way, shape, or form. There has to be stability. And in this case, the court sides with contracts and charters as pillars of stability in what it saw as maybe the riskiness of state legislatures. State legislatures, they might be too inclined to do whatever it was the population wanted at the time, but that's not good for a country. Countries need stability. And in this case, it said states are not allowed to simply intervene and void existing charters. Marshall's decision protected private corporations from state government overreach. They reinforced the inviolability of contracts and helped to define the American legal environment as friendly, as safe, and stable for both domestic and foreign investment. The legacy of judicial federalism is cooler than the little dance that John Marshall is doing right there. This really builds, I would say, the foundation of what we're going to see later on, both for the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's going to become much, much, much less important now for a while until really we get to Dred Scott and then much, much further beyond into the Warren Court. But the bottom line is under the Marshall Court, they were able to, number one, assert the power of judicial review, which was not in the Constitution. Number two, expand federal authority through broad interpretations of the commerce and necessary and proper clauses. Number three, protect federal institutions from state interference. And number four, uphold the sanctity of private contracts from state encroachment. This body of law placed the Constitution, and by extension the federal government, at the center of American political life. It limited the sovereignty of the states in key areas and made the Supreme Court the guardian of constitutional boundaries. Even after Marshall's death in 1835, the principles that he established would long endure, though later courts would sometimes retreat from his nationalist vision, especially during the states' rights debates of the antebellum South, as we'll see. His framework of judicial federalism remained the foundation.